Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Daniel Ackerson. I'm the Education Public Programs Manager here at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, and I'm super excited about this event. We've been planning this event since December. Christian and Kenneth, when I got this job, I thought, in my mind, I was like, what could be the ideal fantasy panel? And here it is. It's a dull anecdote, but I was like, wow, and now it's come true. So I'm very, very, very happy about what is happening here today. Unfortunately, Marjorie Perloff could not make it today. She had to take care of some family matters that were completely out of her hands and out of our hands. I plan to bring her back eventually for something else, because she can handle pretty much everything intellectually. She's a rock star. Just a couple of things about our guests who are here today, ChristianBo and kandKennethGoldsmith. Christian wrote the book Crystallography and was awarded the 2002 Griffin Prize in Poetry, one of the most prestigious prizes in poetry in Canada. And Crystallography is one of my favorite books of poetry ever. And it's just astonishing and crushing and lovely and all these amazing things. kandKennethGoldsmith, Kenneth, most recently, he was the Museum of Modern Art Poets Laureate, which is the first time that ever happens. It's a kind of incredible thing. Published the books including The Weather and Sports, and also the non-fiction book and creative writing. So basically this is how it's going to work. Christian is going to present, and then Kenneth will present, and then there will be a little Q&A after all, so that please join me in welcoming ChristianBo.
In lieu of Marjorie Perloff delivering what we hoped might be an introduction to conceptual literature for you, I'm actually going to take the next 10 minutes to chat about conceptual literature, and then I'll surrender the stage to my compadre, Kenneth Goldsmith, who will regale you, after which then I will come up and actually do a poetry reading. Conceptual literature constitutes one of the recent trends in the avant-garde, supplanting the dominant literary genres of experimentation from the last 4 decades of poetry. And varied poets, including Kenneth Goldsmith, Robert Fitterman, Vanessa Place, Craig Dworkin, Simon Morris, Nick Thurston, Caroline Bergvall, Derek Beaulieu, and Darren Werschler, among others, have all contributed to the formation of this global school of poetics, whose research explores the limit cases of writing as a concept, doing so in order to trouble the romantic literary bastions of both creativity and authorship. Conceptual literature has burgeoned into a respected aesthetic movement since its inception in 1996. Marjorie Perloff has already curated a conference entitled Conceptual Poetry and Its Others in 2008 at the University of Arizona, so as to discuss the growing concern about this trend in America, while Northwestern University Press has gone on to publish a 600-page anthology of conceptual literature, a tome entitled Against Expression, edited by Craig Dworkin and Kenneth Goldsmith. Within the last couple of years alone, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver and the Power Plant in Toronto have actually staged artistic exhibits dedicated entirely to the poetic legacy of this movement. Now, Kenneth Goldsmith, my friend here, the American exponent of this group, has received much popular fanfare in the media over the last 5 years for his provocations. And as a result, critics have paid virtually exclusive attention to his work, occasionally extolling the achievements of others like Robert Fitterman, Vanessa Place, and Simon Morris. And while critics have written essays about the influence of this movement upon poetry in America over the last decade, most of the studies do not acknowledge the impact of Canadian thinkers like me upon conceptualism, even though 2 of the 3 original founders of this group are in fact Canadian literati. Okay, it's technically a Canadian movement. They include Darren Werschler and me. Now, Darren Werschler, in a book called Free as in Speech and Beer, has noted that current trends in digitized sampling and networked exchange have already begun to challenge the propriety of copyright through plagiaristic appropriation and computerized reduplication. Many poets have begun to question the lyrical mandate of originality so as to explore the potential of uncreative literature written with diminished investment in both authorial expressiveness and authorial intentionality. Such poets have begun to use stolen words, forced rules, asemic forms, even cyborg tools in order to mobilize a diverse variety of anti-expressive, anti-discursive strategies that trouble the poetic values of lyric style. Jonathan Lethem, for example, has broached such a topic in his own plagiarized essay about plagiarized works under the title The Ecstasy of Influence, where he argues that literature has been in a plundered, fragmentary state for a long time. Marjorie Perloff in Unoriginal Genius has likewise argued that the concept of genius as an innovative authority able to generate masterpieces without precedent existence has become seemingly untenable in the era of the internet. Nothing, in her words, has quite prepared the world for the claim now being made by conceptual poets that it is possible to write poetry that is entirely unoriginal and nevertheless still qualifies as poetry. Conceptual literature confronts the self-conscious, self-assertive values of lyricism by offering alternatives to this normative condition of writing. Alternatives inspired in part by the procedural artwork of American conceptual artists from the 1960s, artists like Sol LeWitt, Joseph Kosuth, Douglas Huebler, Lawrence Weiner, and Don Carrara, among others. And this precedent in the history of art strives to reduce creativity itself to a tautological array of preconceived rules whose logic culminates not in the mandatory creation of a concrete object, but in the potential argument for some abstract schema about art itself. So in this respect, conceptual artists recognize that art, after Marcel Duchamp, has become so abstracted and so minimalist in its essence that the existence of the objet d'art has dematerialized altogether. Conceptual artworks often exist only in the form of the instructions needed to make the art itself, so that when Yoko Ono, for example, exhibits as a painting, her directive for painting the painting, going so far as to ask many visitors to cut out their favorite parts until the whole thing is gone, she displays an oeuvre to be imagined by the mind rather than produced by the hand, a painting to construct in your head. Now we can imagine cognates, of course, for this in the world of literature. Ideas that we conceive for works now become systemic axioms, and the works that we generate from these ideas now become elective proofs. The concept for the artwork now absorbs the quality of the artwork itself. The idea for a work supplants the work, and the idea renders the genesis of the work optional, if not needless. The writer no longer cultivates any subjective readerships by writing a text to be read, so much as the writer cultivates a collective thinkership, an audience that no longer has to read the text to appreciate the importance of its innovation. And I might suggest that Kenneth Goldsmith is now among the most famous poets in the world, despite the fact that nobody reads him. The text no longer begs to be read clearly for the quality of its content, but rather begs to be seen blankly for the novelty of its concept. Now, somebody like Jean Baudrillard has, of course, lamented this reversal of aesthetic valuation, decrying it as yet another symptom of the postmodern simulacrum in which the sign displaces the real. Conceptual artwork for him has now become a conspiracy in which both the artists and the markets collude, preserving only the idea of art long after the work of art itself has disappeared into its own abstraction. The idea of art has become rarefied and minimal, leading ultimately to conceptual art, where it ends in the non-exhibition of non-works in non-galleries, the apotheosis of art as non-event, and as a corollary, the consumer circulates in all this in order to experience non-enjoyment. Conceptual writers have in turn responded to such a challenge by striving to replace the expressive intentions of the self with a whole array of apparently impossible poetic values, arguing for styles of poetry dismissed by skeptics as uncreative, unoriginal, uninspired, even uneventful. For such poets, the concept for the work now absorbs the quality of the work itself. The idea renders the genesis of the work optional, if not needless. A writer no longer cultivates individual readerships, but thinkerships. Kenneth Goldsmith argues that such poetry now applies principles of conceptualism in artwork from the 1960s to techniques of writing in the 2000s, so as to show that for poetry, context is the new content. Goldsmith has even published a book entitled Uncreative Writing, which showcases many of these provocations, earning him appearances not only at the White House addressing Barack Obama, but also on the Colbert Report addressing Stephen Colbert. Such celebrity has incited argumentation throughout the blogosphere as writers come to grips with the official, mandated recognition of a literature defined entirely by the automation of creativity itself. Kenneth Goldsmith, for example, encourages his own students to commit acts of temeritous plagiarism, and he describes his own work as a banal brand of both word processing and data management. I am a word processor, he says, noting that the simple act of moving information from one place to another constitutes a significant cultural act. For him, writing requires the expertise of a secretary crossed with the attitude of a pirate, with each poet duplicating a text or bootlegging a copy. And for him, artists now acquire cultural prestige from the quality of both their sampling and remixing, rather than from the quality of any original idea or any peerless form. Now, conceptual poets in America and Britain have thus received much attention, primarily for these works that have indulged in acts of recontextualized misappropriation. Kenneth Goldsmith in Day, for example, has plagiarized every piece of text in a single Sunday edition of the New York Times, republishing this complete document as a book so as to submit it to the newspaper successfully for review in its Sunday review of books. Simon Morris, in Getting Inside Jack Kerouac's Head, has likewise typed out the entirety of On the Road by Jack Kerouac, 1 page per day on a blog, only to republish this output as a pirated edition, virtually identical to the classic Penguin edition. Robert Fitterman in Now We Are Friends even goes so far as to use online search tools in order to stalk a random person online named Benjamin Kessler, collecting and reprinting information about him in a book for launch at a gala, to which Benjamin Kessler is then invited as an honored literary guest. Vanessa Place in Statement of Facts upstages even these acts of temerity by reprinting all the court records and all the crime reports written by her as an attorney defending a particularly horrid rapist, thereby republishing this material as a work of literature, even though it already is available in the public domain. Now, while works produced by such poets in both America and Britain have enjoyed critical approval from reviewers, works by Canadians have received less consideration, even though many Canadian examples have become somewhat canonical to the movement itself. For example, works like The Tapeworm Foundry by Darren Werschler, Poets and Killers by Helen Hanoshky, If Language by Greg Betts, Flatland by Derek Beaulieu, and Apostrophe by Bill Kennedy and Darren Werschler, just to name but 5 works. The Tapeworm Foundry, for example, lists all the great ideas for potential aesthetic projects by the author, who gives his ideas away for free. Poets and Killers recounts the biography of a male poet, retelling his story by quoting advertisements published in each year of his life. If Language creates anagrams by repeatedly reordering the same fund of letters found in a single paragraph from an essay by Steve McCaffrey. Flatland maps successive occurrence of letters in a novel by Edwin A. Abbott, diagramming the dispersal of the alphabet throughout the entire text. And Apostrophe collates all the results of a Google search on the phrase, "you are." Each work exemplifies one of the 4 limit cases of writing, what I call limit cases. Works such as these address a quadrivium of extreme formats for expression, and I divide them into 4 categories. The ready-made writing of the unoriginal text, the mannerist writing of the constrained text, the illegible writing of the unreadable text, and the aleatoric writing of the authorless text. Such poets reframe these acts of writing, be they derived from stolen words or forced rules, asemic forms, and cyborg tools, doing so in order to replace the expressive intentions of the author with a whole array of apparently impossible poetic values, arguing for the viability of work that skeptics might otherwise dismiss as uninspired. American critics, such as Robert ChristianBo and others, have often dismissed conceptual literature as a weird genre of writing because of its obdurate, if not hermetic, frivolity, which to them makes such works inscrutable, if not unteachable. However, the practitioners of conceptual literature, like the 2 of us, for example, you're about to see, often demonstrate that such literary concepts are actually much easier to apprehend than naysayers might think. We are undoubtedly going to illustrate the appeal of some of these limit cases by showing that far from being a banal brand of either word processing or data management, such writing can in fact be charismatic in its presentation. Now, Craig Dworkin, a good friend of mine, has written 2 books of scholarship, Reading the Illegible and No Medium, both of which argue that dismissals of the avant-garde as illegible constitute ideological assessments meant to excuse critics from ever having to contend with the limit cases of writing. You simply have to dismiss it as it's unreadable or it's illegible, and then you're therefore excused from having to address it. He then goes on to demonstrate the ease with which he can perform the closest textual analysis on even the most resistant, difficult works, blank books, white noise, empty films, even asemic visual poems without words. He does brilliant readings of them. He shows that such writing does not indulge in novelty for its own sake, as skeptics might aver, and instead such writing illuminates the limits of what is conceivable as writing. Conceptual literature might constitute what Dworkin calls the writing of the new formalism, insofar as such literature imposes arbitrary but axiomatic dicta upon the writing process, doing so in order to extract an otherwise unthought potential from such a structural constraint. Conceptual literature reveals that in such a culture, writing now finds itself governed not by the whim of a self, but by the rule of a game, a kind of language game, like the ones discussed by Ludwig Wittgenstein, who notes that when playing such a game, we look to the rule for instruction and do something, without appealing to anything else for guidance. The poet subordinates all subjectivity to this rule, replacing an act of volitive expression with an act of negative capability. The poet constrains the cognitive functions of the self on behalf of other aesthetic functions in the text, be they ready-made, mannerist, illegible, or aleatoric, thus exploring the limits of what writing itself can do. I'd like to introduce you now to Kenneth Goldsmith.
I used to be an artist, then I became a poet, then a writer. Now when asked, I simply refer to myself as a word processor. Writing should be as effortless as washing the dishes and as interesting. Hunter S. Thompson retyped Hemingway and Fitzgerald novels. He said, "I just want to know what it feels like to write these words." Obama regularly copies his speechwriter's work out in longhand on legal pads in pencil. It helps organize my thoughts. If you're not making art with the intention of having it copied, you're not really making art for the 21st century. From producer to reproducer. Authenticity is another form of artifice. It is possible to be both inauthentic and sincere. The moment you stand up in front of people, you are no longer authentic. The telling of a true story is an unnatural act. Art dealer to Captain Beefheart. You'll never be respected as an artist. You'll always be a musician that paints. If you really want to be a painter, you have to stop doing music. Not long after, Captain Beefheart began referring to himself as Don Van Vliet. A child could do what I do, but wouldn't dare to for fear of being called stupid. The internet is of no relevance at all to writing fiction, which expresses verities found only through observation and introspection, said Jonathan Franzen. Jonathan Franzen famously wrote portions of the corrections wearing a blindfold and earplugs to reduce disruptions. Jonathan Franzen is America's greatest novelist of the 1950s. The new memoir is our browser history. writers are becoming curators of language, a move similar to the emergence of the curator as artist in the visual arts. Sampling and citation are but boutique forms of appropriation. Remixing is often mistaken for appropriation. Our poetry is now beginning to resemble data trails. The internet is the greatest poem ever written, unreadable mostly because of its size. An article in China Daily refers to a young worker who copied a dozen novels, signed his name, and published a collection of his works. Richard Prince recently took America's most valuable literary property, The Catcher in the Rye, and made drop-dead facsimiles, word for word, of the first edition. Everywhere Salinger's name appears, Prince substitutes his. He sells a signed copy bearing the signature of Richard Prince for whatever Salinger's signed first edition is going for that day. Contemporary writing is the evacuation of content. The future of writing is the management of emptiness. The future of writing is pointing. The future of writing is not writing. The future of reading is not reading. The human entity formerly known as the reader. John Cage and Morton Feldman in 1967. Feldman was complaining about being at the beach, annoyed by transistor radios blasting out rock and roll. And Cage responded, "You know how I adjusted to the problem of the radio in the environment? Very much as primitive people adjusted to the animals which frightened them, and which, as you probably say, were intrusions. They drew pictures of them on their caves. And so I made a piece simply using radios. Now, whenever I hear radios, not just 12 at a time, as you must have heard on the beach, but even a single one, I think, well, they're just playing my piece." Andy Warhol said, "My style was to spread out anyways rather than move up. To me, the ladder of success was much more sideways than vertical." Yohji Yamamoto, "Start copying what you love. Copying, copying, copying. And at the end of the copy, you will find yourself." Cory Doctorow on copying. "It's not a bug, it's a feature." Bob Dylan on appropriation. "Wussies and pussies complain about it." They spoke of the idea that in China, additional books are written and inserted into extant canons. There are 10 Harry Potter books in the Chinese series, as opposed to the 7 penned by J.K. Rowling. Individual creativity is a dogma of contemporary soft capitalism rather than the domain of nonconformist artists. Fiction is everywhere. Toward the end of his life, Alexander Trocki rewrote his early manuscripts in longhand and sold them to collectors as originals. Ted Berrigan stole books by famous authors and forged their autographs. He then sold them back to the dealers he stole them from at greatly increased prices. Today's plagiarism and copyright battles are to the 21st century what the obscenity trials were to the 20th. At Tony Alzer's retrospective at the Williams College Museum of Art, upstairs, buried deep within the galleries, the artist had set up a microphone into which anyone could step up and speak. What they said would be broadcast into the entrance atrium of the museum. There were no restrictions on what you could say, only a small note reminding the speaker to be sensitive of others and a gentle suggestion to refrain from swearing. When it was my turn, I said in my clearest and most radio-like voice, "May I have your attention? May I have your attention? The museum is now closing. Please make your way to the exit. Thank you for visiting." Although it was hours away from closing, I repeated the announcement again and saw in the video monitor provided people streaming toward the exit. Again, I made my announcement. At once, a frantic elderly guard came running up to me, grabbing my arm, and said, "You're not allowed to say that." When I told him there was nothing prohibiting me from saying it, he again told me that I wasn't allowed. "Why?" I asked. "Because it's not true," he replied. "You must stop saying that right now." Of course, I repeated my announcement again. This poor man was really struggling with what to do with me. He knew that while I wasn't breaking any real laws, by questioning the institution's authority, I was breaking an unwritten social contract. There are no correct readings, only reproductions and possibilities. The problem isn't piracy. The problem is obscurity. Being well known enough to be pirated is a crowning achievement. Most artists want first and foremost to be loved, and secondly to make history. Money is a distant third. Information is like a bank. Our job is to rob that bank. The idea of recycling language is politically and ecologically sustainable, one which promotes reuse and reconditioning as opposed to the manufacture and consumption of the new. Interest has shifted from the object to the information. People insist on self-expression. I really am opposed to it. I don't think people should express themselves in that kind of a way. Shortly before he died, we were invited to dinner at Merce Cunningham's loft on 6th Avenue. Upon entering, we were astonished to see numerous priceless works of art lining the walls. When we inquired, we were unceremoniously cut off and told that everything here is what you think it is. There were Johnses and Rauschenbergs and even a little Duchamp Zonk check framed in a 70s plexiglass frame close to the floor, covered in cooking grease and dust and cat piss. Over many valuable works of art were leaky skylights. During dinner, we asked Merce what would happen if one of those works were damaged. He smiled and said, "But of course, our friends would just make us another." If you do something wrong for long enough, people will eventually think of it as right. Art is a license to do things wrong. The rest of the world tries to get it right. We revel in doing it wrong, not knowing, breaking things. I wanted to do a bad book just the way I'd done bad movies and bad art, because when you do something exactly wrong, you always turn up something, said Andy Warhol. Getting it wrong is a privilege that happens only after getting it right. Toward a disengaged poetics, writing books without the need to have any relationship with the subject that we're writing about. Writing is paint by numbers, just filling in the blanks. Quality, not quantity. With larger numbers of things, judgment decreases and curiosity increases. In China, after I'd finished giving a lengthy talk about conceptual poetics, plagiarism, and writing in the digital age, an elderly woman in the audience raised her hand and asked, "But Professor Goldsmith, you didn't discuss your relationship to Longfellow." There are no more writings and no more writers because in the 21st century, these have become data and metadata. Choice is authorship, legitimate authorship. Easy is the new difficult. It is difficult to be difficult, but it is even more difficult to be easy. At the Iowa Writers' Workshop recently, they were experiencing a crisis. The remoteness of the location traditionally offered the writer two choices: either look into thy heart or look to nature. But once they had the internet, they began looking into the screen. The idea of celebrities adopting art strategies. They're so bored with their creative acts that they're ready to be uncreative. The recent durational performances by Jay-Z, Tilda Swinton, and The National are making boring mainstream. Soon we'll have to find another line of work. Acting is plagiarism. I'd never heard of Shia LaBeouf until he started quoting me extensively on the web, claiming my words as his own, claiming me as his collaborator. Normally, when these kind of scandals break, what we see is a James Fry going out and apologizing. He is shamed and everybody's shamed. LaBeouf plagiarized, and instead of apologizing, he decided to tap into the vast bodies of strategies around free culture that have been developed over the last 100 years and use that as a defense instead of a typical apology. Today we face what I call the LaBeoufian moment. The limiting point at which all art based on questioning authorship is now pointless. But what must have become art post-LaBeouf? Namjoon Pike once said that the internet is for everybody who doesn't live in New York City. Just before the reading at the White House, Obama passed through the green room where we were sitting. He stopped, looked at us, pointed a finger, and said smilingly, "You guys behave." Suddenly, the voice of God boomed, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." As he was about to take the stage, he turned heel, popped his head back into the room, stared at us long and hard, and said, "No, you guys are artists. Misbehave." I always joke with my students that poetry couldn't be as hard as they think it is, because if it were as hard as they thought it was, poets wouldn't do it. Really, they're the laziest, stupidest people I know. They become poets in part because they were demoted to that job, right? You should never tell your students to write what they know because, of course, they know nothing. They're poets. If they knew something, they'd be in that discipline actually doing it. They'd be in history or physics or math or business or whatever it is that they could excel, said ChristianBo. 2 back-to-back readings, the first in Chicago, met at the airport by limousine, which drives me to a glamorous and crowded art venue where no one listens. Chauffeured back to the airport all in one day. Superb pay. The next night, I do a reading at a tiny bar in the East Village. Took the subway there. 10 engaged people in the audience. No pay. Turns out to be the best reading I've ever done. Overwhelmed by so many requests to blurb books, I began a system of conceptual blurbing. I say to an author, write or steal the blurb of your dreams and sign my name to it. I don't wish to see it until I receive the book. That way I can be surprised by anyone, like anyone else, by what I've written. Love art, hate the art world. The art world is cleaved between the market and the academy. A third way, become your own self-invented institution. When the art world can produce something as compelling as Twitter, we'll start paying attention to it again. The gallery and museum world feels too slow, out of touch with the rest of culture, like an antiques market, highly priced, unique objects at a time when value is in the multiple, the many, the distributed, the democratic. In this way, the art world is quickly making itself irrelevant. Soon, no one will care. Sometimes I feel guys sitting in cubicles understand contemporary culture better than most curators do. To construct a career based on the ephemerality of the meme is at once thrilling and terrifying. If I raised my kids the way I write my books, I would have been thrown in jail a long time ago. Every word I say is stupid and false. All and all, I am a pseudo, said Marcel Duchamp. Beckett, in 1984, on Duchamp's Ready-Mades, a writer could not do that. There is nothing that cannot be called writing, no matter how much it might not look like writing. All text is used, soiled, and worn. All language presenting itself as new is recycled. No word is virginal. No word is innocent. Interviewer. In an interview with Michael Palmer, he testifies he prefers writing by hand over typing because the former is a more intimate physical experience. How do you feel about doing everything by computer? Goldsmith. I honestly think Palmer's statement is the most idiotic thing I've ever heard. He must be living in a cave. Writing on an electronic platform is not only writing, but also doubles as archiving. The two processes are inseparable. After giving a reading, another reader on the bill came up to me and exclaimed, "But you didn't write a word you spoke tonight." It was true. Somehow during Christmas time, in a small house crammed with extended family, reading the Sunday paper is acceptable, but reading a book is considered antisocial and rude. Many times I've been asked while reading, "Is everything all right?" Driving down a Los Angeles boulevard, a billboard was legible from half a mile away. It said one or two words. In Los Angeles, people are used to reading single words at very large distances and passing by them very quickly. It's totally the opposite in New York, where we get our information from reading a newspaper over somebody's shoulder in the subway. Pointing at the best information trumps creating the best information. Preloading, constructing a flawless writing machine before the writing starts, alleviates the burden of success or failure, mitigates the ego, annuls the small-mindedness of authorship that invariably comes with a more conventional mode of writing. When you challenge someone not to read, they read closer. When you say a text is unreadable, you guarantee yourself a readership. Many years ago, on the way to England to work on a museum project, I was seated in the plane next to a young man who was a classical lute player. We got to talking, and I asked him what he was listening to on his Discman. He showed me the CD and began talking about the music. It was a collection of a minor composer's music played from transcriptions of broadsides that were sold on the streets for pennies in the Middle Ages. The composer, however, was clever and included beautifully hand-drawn images on his scores. Over the years, they were framed and preserved not so much because of the music, but because of how beautiful they were as objects. While his peers' music, printed and distributed in the same form without decoration, vanished, this composer's scores remain as the only example of the genre. By default, they are now considered classics. We really don't seem to believe that copyright exists, nor do we particularly care. If you make it good and interesting and not ridiculing or offensive, the creators of the original material will like it, said Christian Marclay about not clearing any permissions for the clock. W.G. Sebald's advice to creative writing students: I encourage you to steal as much as you can. No one will ever notice. Conceptual writing is a practice that lies somewhere between constructing a Duchampian ready-made and downloading an MP3. Life can only imitate the web, and the web itself is only a tissue of signs, a lost, infinitely remote imitation. When asked at the end of his life how it was being an artist, John Dubuffet said, "I feel like I've been on vacation for the past 40 years." Thank you.